Welcome back, everybody. This is video part 2 in the alternator generator build project. I am trying to build a DC generator, something that I can use to recharge my 48-volt battery bank, but I'm using a standard off-the-shelf 12-volt car alternator. Well, in video part number 1, we built the project, we assembled it, and it actually did work, but it had some flaws. So this video, part number 2, we're going to try to fix the flaws. I'm going to answer your most common questions from video part number 1. We're going to take some temperature measurements, and we're also going to run a fuel economy test and find out how many kilowatt hours can we get out of a gallon of gasoline using this homemade setup. Here we go. Hi everyone, I'm David, and I'm on a mission to take my house and garage off-grid. Now typically I do that most of the year with solar, but sometimes in the winter the sun doesn't quite shine enough and I need to supplement with a generator. I've always been interested, can I take a 12-volt car alternator and use it to recharge a 48-volt battery bank? Now there's a whole lot of unknowns in the project, but in part number 1 video we assembled it and it actually worked. We could pull up to 3 kilowatts from this thing, and I was blown away we could get that much. The biggest problem we had was the vibrations. I mean, this thing wanted to shake itself apart, and it was kind of walking around on the patio pavers outside. I had so many wonderful comments from all of you watching, suggesting that I hard mount the alternator to the engine, and there were several suggestions on how to do that, and thank you. So let's jump right into that and talk about how we mounted the two together. The first thing I wanted to do was build a new subframe, but I wanted it large enough to hold both the engine and the alternator, and I wanted it stiff enough. I cut a piece of 1/4-inch thick steel plate, and I'm using a saw specifically made for cutting steel plate that I'll leave a link to in the description below. Now this 1/4-inch thick steel plate, I think it was 15 inches by 18 inches by the time I was done, just large enough to fit both the engine and alternator on it. I was a little bit concerned there might still be some amount of flex in the steel plate, so I wanted to stiffen it up. So I ran a piece of steel angle iron across the length of it. This is 1.5-inch legs and 1/8-inch thick steel angle iron. So I consider that my strong back to really stiffen up the whole steel plate. I added a second little piece of that angle iron so that I could create the mount for the alternator. And those are all welded in place using a flux core welder. I realized that I did not line up my 2 holes perfectly. When I put in the bolt, you can see they're not lined up quite right. If I add this, alright, so here's the square, and here's where it originally sat, and now pulled straighter. See that? Oh, and by the way, all the tools that you see me use in this video, we're running all of these off the Schneider inverter because I'm running completely off-grid at the moment, and the Schneider inverter is powering both the house, garage, and all the power tools all at the same time. In order to isolate the steel plate from the plywood base, I'm using the same rubber mounts that I used in the first video. Now the studs are not long enough to go down through the entire thickness of the plywood, which would have been nice, but instead what I did was I made a couple of little brackets to hold the mounts on, and those brackets are screwed to the plywood. So now I've got a new really stiff contraption here to hold both, and I ran a test run. It worked really well. So everybody, if you're going to try to build something like this, learn from my mistake the first time and know that the alternator and engine have to be rigidly mounted together. Thank you everybody for those comments. They were very helpful. I have a couple of bolts sticking up through there. I put a piece of plywood underneath to support the head of the bolt so that it doesn't push all the way down and out. Got it. Now we'll just tighten that down. I had to cut down and change the heat sink that I used last time. This is a thick aluminum heat sink, and I'm able to cut that using my table saw with a carbide tooth blade. The biggest thing to remember when cutting aluminum with a table saw, you will get some aluminum shavings going everywhere, so it's really important to wear some eye protection, and you have to go really slow. It is easy to overheat the table saw blade when cutting aluminum, and that will cause it to warp. But if you just take your time and ease it in there, let the saw do the work, then you can keep it cool enough, and I don't have any trouble. My blade is still straight after doing this now several times. When I mounted the full bridge rectifiers to the new heatsink, I used some thermal paste underneath them. Now, last time I used a thermal pad, but I didn't have more of that, and the thermal pad is really a one-time use thing before it starts getting all messed up. So I used some thermal paste, and later on, when we look at the thermal imaging camera, you'll see that that actually worked really well. Now, there's no fan on the heatsink, but it turned out I didn't need it. These full bridge rectifiers, I don't think they ever got over 48 degrees Celsius, and the heatsink was probably picking up a lot of heat from the steel plate because they're mounted together, and the steel plate is picking up heat from the engine. So all that could be improved, but you know, it still ran cool enough, and so I'm not sure I'm going to bother improving it as of right now. I remounted everything, so now we should have a lot less vibrations. I took off the back plastic cover because I had at least one person ask for the temperature of the brushes. We still have the buck converter. This is going to supply 12 volts to the field winding. I added a switch on here. I'm using the DC to DC buck converter to energize the rotor inside the alternator. Now that rotor is an electromagnet. It creates a magnetic field which induces the voltage on the stator. I wanted to do that so that this was all a closed loop system. So I'm not introducing an external power source, which I certainly could have done. I could have used an external power supply, a 12 volt power supply, or I could have used an external battery connected up to the rotor. But I thought it would just be really cool if I could get the whole thing kind of closed loop on the one contraption that I'm building. The DC to DC buck converter is taking the power from the bus bars, which are the high voltage. Something that might have been missed from the first video is that there are some rubber feet underneath the plywood. So between the plywood and the concrete pavers, there's already some rubber feet under there. The typical setup for this is the generator is going to be outside because it's producing fumes. You don't want that indoors. But the charge controller and the battery, they're going to be inside a building somewhere. The charge controller wants to be as close to the battery as possible, meaning that this wire is the one that could be very long. You might have 60 feet going from outside where the generator is to indoors where the charge controller is. So we want a higher voltage coming out of the alternator to the charge controller. And then the charge controller is going to step that down, increase the amperage, and we want that on the thicker wires right to the battery. Now, depending on how long we run this whole test and contraption, we might overcharge this battery. So I will be turning on a little space heater and inverter just to keep the battery at a lower state of charge. Well, with the new contraption, the belt is a lot stiffer, and I think we're going to really have taken care of that vibration issue. Several people had recommended that I could maybe add a small battery pack with a momentary switch to start this up, or maybe a little capacitor bank to start it up. All great ideas, but not really the focus of this video. I picked up a thermal imaging camera. Actually, it was sent to me for free, but I'm not doing a full review video on it, but I will leave a link in the description below. I'm going to turn on the thermal imaging camera now, and we'll take a starting temperature of all the components. I was really excited to get this outside and test it and find out how hot is this alternator getting. First thing I'd like to point out, this alternator has 2 fans built inside of it. So we're already getting a lot of active cooling from this thing. So I wanted to make sure that I ran this for at least an hour to see where the temperature was going to start to stabilize and how many amps can I pull from this and how hot is too hot. This is just a standard car alternator. I think this one was on Ford F-250s and F-350s. So yeah, a truck alternator, but not specifically built for high amperage applications. I ran it for, I think that was 10 or 15 minutes at 50 amps, and we were starting to get a bit over 100 degrees Celsius. 10 minutes. The magnet wire that is used to make the stator, that typically has a 160, 180 degrees Celsius rating on it. Just kind of arbitrarily, I chose to say 100 degrees Celsius is kind of my threshold. So I wanted to figure out how much load can I put on this sustained and not get over 100 degrees Celsius. When I started out at 50 amps, after about 10 or 15 minutes, we started to get 105, 106. I started to see that number creeping up a little bit more. So I knocked it down and I wound up settling on 40 amps. And this is the charge controller rating. So 40 amps on the charge controller is going to be between 2100 watts and 2200 watts, about there, depending on the voltage of the battery. So at about that rating, this thing could run for over an hour and be sitting there at 100, 101, maybe 102 degrees Celsius, but we weren't getting any hotter than that. All right, 1 hour into the test. And then when I ran out of gasoline from the tank and the whole system just suddenly shut off while under load, nothing cooked. There was no smoke getting let out from the bearings or the stator windings, nothing overheated, everything just seemed fine. So I would say that is a good sustained temperature that we were at. I also took some temperature readings of the brush housing on the back, and that ran cool. And I don't think I ever saw the full bridge rectifiers get over 48 degrees Celsius the whole time we were running. So the passive heatsink that I have on here was plenty to dissipate the heat from the full bridge rectifiers. So all of that seemed to work out really well. A lot of people seemed really concerned whether or not the capacitor was going to be large enough to handle taking care of any ripple current that might exist on this type of setup. So I took a few extra measurements. While this was running under load, I found 0.18 amps moving in and out of the capacitor. So that's the ripple current amperage. Now this particular capacitor is rated for 6.8 amps of ripple current. So we are way below that. So the capacitor that I have here is actually really oversized for the amount of ripple current we might have, and we're putting in much cleaner power into that charge controller. Now, it's important to note that I'm using a Victron charge controller, which is designed for solar input, not something from an alternator. Solar input is going to be a lot cleaner DC compared to something like this, which is why I'm using the capacitor to help clean that signal up. How many amps does the rotor draw from the buck converter? Well, it turns out it maxed out the buck converter. The buck converter is rated for 12 volts, 5 amps, which is 60 watts, and the rotor pulled all of it. But the good news is that the DC to DC buck converter did not overheat. And, the alternator didn't overheat. I mean, everything just ran the way it was supposed to be. So we were pulling 5 amps at 12 volts into the rotor. Now for the big question. What's the fuel economy of this setup? How many kilowatt hours can I put into the battery for a gallon of gasoline? To start the fuel economy test, I ran the generator under full load until the engine itself shut off. So that was due to lack of fuel. It shut itself off. We will reset this right there, that button. Yes. So now we're showing 0 watt hours for the day. So this is where we're going to record how much we produce. Then I measured out 1 gallon of gasoline using this little container that I have, and I've used this container in past videos, and I started pouring it in. But this fuel tank doesn't hold a full gallon. So I poured in about, I don't know, half of that, put the cap on, and started the system up. I ran it for about half an hour, and then I was finally able to pour the rest of the gallon in. So I did add 1 gallon of gasoline to the tank. I just had to momentarily stop it for a minute during the test in order to finish topping off the tank. There we go. All right, got the rest in there. And I had set it to 40 amps, so we were doing between 2100 and 2200 watts into the battery. So what was the grand total in the end? We did 4.22? Yeah! Well, that's actually better than I thought we were gonna do. So 4.22 kilowatt hours is actually really good. That is excellent. 4.22 kilowatt hours. That's how much we were able to capture from this setup. Now that might be reading on the PV side of the charge controller. So the charge controller is between 99 and 98% efficient. So 4.2 kilowatt hours into the battery, that's actually better than I was expecting from this contraption of stuff. But is that the best we can do? Well, no. A few months ago, I ran a fuel test using my Honda EU6500 generator, which has an inverter on it, and that thing got 5.8 kilowatt hours per gallon into the battery. That generator is a 120 240 volt generator, and it's running through a chargeverter or a 100 amp charger from Signature Solar. And it turns out that combination is much more efficient than this. So this system with the charge controller, we got 4.2 kilowatt hours per gallon, and the Honda generator, we got 5.8 kilowatt hours per gallon into the battery. So definitely having a generator with a charger is more efficient. Not as much fun though. Part of doing this setup is to see, can I do it? You know, it's the learning process, it's the fun. You might have an old engine from, I don't know, a lawnmower or a snowblower, or you might have an old alternator kicking around. So for a lot of DIYers who have a scrap bin, you might have most of the parts you need. In which case, go for it. It's fun. Now this type of system, I'm only going to need it maybe 100 hours a year. This is not a full-time running thing. The vast majority of the year, the solar panels produce all the energy I need. This is just supplementing in the middle of winter when I've got bad snowstorms. A lot of people were asking the question, why not use the built-in rectifier that already came on this alternator? Well, there's a few reasons, but probably the most obvious is that the rectifiers put off heat. And I was trying to do everything I could to make this thing run as cool as possible. But there are a few less obvious reasons that I also decided to remove the full bridge rectifier from the alternator. So one of the reasons is voltage. I had no idea what voltage I was going to get out of this setup. I was aiming for 80 volts, but what RPM do I have to spin it at to get 80 volts? So by doing the external bridge rectifiers, it meant that I had the option of wiring them in series if I needed to double my voltage. So if I was only able to get 50 volts out of this thing, I could wire the full bridge rectifiers in series. I could get 100 volts out. And that for sure would have worked going into the Victron charge controller. Now speaking about not knowing what kind of voltage I was going to get, on the flip side, I didn't know if maybe I'm going to get 200 volts out of it. I mean, I just didn't know. And I don't know what the voltage rating is of the diodes that are built into the full bridge rectifier. So the voltage rating might be high enough. I mean, it could be a 1,000 volt rated diode, but I just didn't know. So another reason to remove the onboard bridge rectifier is because the negatives are connected. So this is a quick little sketch of the wiring diagram that I made if I used the built-in full bridge rectifier. We have a stator here. I drew one stator just for the sake of simplicity in the wiring diagram. This is our rotor. That's the electromagnet. So when we talk about energizing the field coil, that's what we're talking about. This is our DC to DC buck converter. This is going to take the high voltage DC in and put out a constant 12 volts and up to 5 amps to the rotor. So the stator has 3 wires coming out going to the full bridge rectifier, which is then putting out a positive DC side and a negative DC side. That negative side is directly connected to the aluminum housing of the alternator. The rotor negative, which is the brush negative, is also directly connected to the aluminum housing of the alternator. So we have a direct connection right here. Now that means that the 12 volt DC out of the buck converter is also directly connected to the aluminum housing of the alternator. So we have a direct connection, direct connection. The positive side goes to the positive bus bar where we've got the capacitor there, but we've also got the lead going off to the buck converter. So the positive lead is going to the buck converter. So note here that the buck converter has this negative path that's directly connected. The rotor has a negative path directly connected, but the positives are isolated. Well, at least in theory. See, I don't know exactly how this buck converter is built. So I was really worried about sending the full stator voltage into the rotor and then burning up the rotor. And I was worried about burning up the buck converter. Both of those things have the potential of happening if something fails in this setup. So I decided that by removing the full bridge rectifier, we'd go to this setup. So now we have an external full bridge rectifier. Notice we've removed the negative connection. So now there's much less likelihood that I could smoke it. I could burn something out. So there's still a chance, but now, in my opinion, I've reduced the risk. So the whole thing worked really well. We didn't overheat it. We took care of that vibration issue. We got 4.2 kilowatt hours out for every gallon of gasoline we put in. So the whole project was an overall success in my book. And man, I learned a lot and had a ton of fun. I hope you all enjoyed the journey with me. Thank you everybody so much for watching. If you enjoy these videos, please like, subscribe, and comment down below and let me know your thoughts on it. Thank you everybody for watching.